People laughed when Loretta and Dale paid $7 for the little house at the county tax sale. Dale pulled the bills from his wallet slowly, flattening each one with his thumb before he handed it over, while a few men near the back grinned like they had just been handed the best part of their morning. Loretta signed the paper, eyes down, and felt that old familiar sting, the one that comes when people stop seeing your struggle and start treating it like entertainment. From the road, the house looked like proof they had run out of road. Sagging roof, vines up the walls, windows gone cloudy with age, a place so small and worn it seemed the world had already counted it out. But the world was wrong. The moment Loretta stepped inside, she felt cold under the floorboards. Dale shoved aside an old cabinet, found an iron ring in the wood, and pulled. When the hidden hatch opened, cold air rose from the dark beneath the house, and everything people thought they knew about that $7 mistake began to change. Subscribe now and stay with me, because what was waiting under that floor was more than a secret. It was the beginning of their comeback. And that was the part nobody in that room understood. To them, Loretta and Dale were just an older couple doing something foolish in public. Two quiet people with worn clothes, careful hands, and the kind of tired posture strangers mistake for defeat. No one there could see the years behind them, the skipped repairs, the bills paid late, but still paid, the slow shrinking of a life that had once felt steady enough. They saw $7 in a ruined little house. They did not see everything it had cost just to keep showing up. The county sale moved with the usual dry rhythm of places where hardship gets read off paper like weather. A parcel number, a location, back taxes, next item. Most of the room barely listened. Men shifted in folding chairs, boots scraped the floor. A few people leaned back with coffee in hand, waiting for something worth their interest. Then, the little overgrown property came up, and the room changed, not because anyone wanted it, but because everyone already seemed to agree it was beneath wanting. The clerk read the description too quickly, his voice flattening around the word structure on sight, as if even he had no reason to dress the thing up. Someone near the back let out a short laugh. Another man asked whether the roof was included or just whatever was left of it. A few smiles spread the way they do when people want the pleasure of cruelty without the inconvenience of owning it. Loretta kept her face still. She had lived long enough to know that some insults only get larger when you answer them too soon. Dale sat beside her with one hand on his knee, thumb moving once, then again, over the seam of his jeans. It was such a small motion most people would miss it. Loretta did not. That was how he held himself together when something landed where pride lived. He kept his eyes forward, not on the men laughing, not on the clerk, just on the table at the front of the room, as if looking anywhere else might make the moment harder to survive. Then Kurt Blevins spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He had the easy confidence of a man used to being listened to in small local rooms. Clean jacket, relaxed shoulders. That half-smile people wear when they want to sound amused and informed at the same time. He said the parcel was nothing but headache ground and a dead-end structure. Said some things were cheaper to leave alone than to own. A couple of men laughed again. Loretta felt that line settled deeper than the rest. Because it was not really about lumber or land. It was about people. About the way age gets mistaken for poor judgment. About the way struggling in public makes other people feel taller. When the clerk asked for an opening bid, the room went quiet in a lazy, certain way. No one lifted a hand. No one called a number. The silence itself became part of the humiliation. Then Dale gave the bid, $7. The clerk looked up, repeated it, waited. His eyes moved once across the room, giving everyone there the chance to save Loretta and Dale from themselves, or to prove Kurt right and take the property instead. No one did, not even Kurt. That was the detail Loretta could not shake. Not the laughter, not the clerk's tone, not even the way a man near the back smirked when the gavel came down. Kurt had known enough to mock the parcel, but not enough to stop them from buying it. By the time Loretta and Dale stepped outside with the receipt, the air had turned thin and cold. Dale folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket like something more fragile than official. They crossed the lot without speaking. At the truck, Loretta opened the passenger door, then stopped with her hand still on the handle. For the first time that morning, She looked back toward the building, and toward the men still inside it. Then she asked the question that would follow them all the way to the property. If that place was truly worthless, why had Kurt Blevins looked relieved when the bidding ended? And once Loretta asked it, neither of them could pretend the question did not matter. The drive out to the property took less than 40 minutes, but it felt longer because silence changed shape inside that truck. It was not the easy kind built by years together. Not the quiet of two people who already knew what the other meant. This one was heavier. Dale kept both hands on the wheel and watched the road with the fixed attention of a man trying not to let his thoughts get ahead of him. Loretta sat with her purse in her lap and looked out at the eastern Kentucky hills, passing in long folds of brown and faded green, the trees still thin in places, the roadside ditches holding the last of the cold season. Every so often she touched the receipt in her coat pocket, as if the paper might explain something if she felt it often enough. The county map had made the parcel look simple. A little square of land off a narrow road, nothing special, nothing complicated. But maps do not carry mood. They do not show how a place can seem to withdraw from the world one turn at a time. By the moment Dale eased the truck onto the last stretch of broken gravel, the property felt less like a purchase and more like something that had been left behind on purpose. The house appeared slowly through the brush. It was smaller than Loretta had imagined, and somehow that hurt more than if it had been larger and more obviously ruined. A big wreck can at least look dramatic. This did not. It looked tired, used up in a quiet way. The roof dipped at one side. Vines had climbed high enough to swallow whole sections of wall. The steps leaned slightly away from the porch, as if even they had begun giving up. One window was so cloudy with age and dirt it reflected no light at all. Another had a crack running through it that looked almost delicate until Loretta noticed the dark water stain beneath it. Dale parked but did not shut the engine off right away. Neither of them moved. That, more than the laughter at the auction, was when the real weight of what they had done settled in. Because a crowd can mock you for a minute and move on. A place like this does not move on. It waits for you to stand in front of it and admit whether you still believe your own decisions. When Dale finally cut the engine, the quiet outside rushed in at once. No highway noise. No nearby voices. Just the click of cooling metal and the faint stir of wind moving through dead vines. Loretta stepped out first. The ground was uneven beneath her shoes, soft in one spot and packed hard in another. The air carried the smell of wet wood, old leaves, and something stale she could not name until she reached the porch and recognized it as long-trapped dampness. Inside, the house felt even smaller. The front room had the close, breathless feel of a place shut too long. Dust softened everything. The walls had taken on that tired, yellow-gray color old houses get when light stops reaching them properly. There was an old cabinet against one wall, a rusted sink in the next room, a strip of linoleum curling up at the edge like a peeling scab. Nothing about it said fresh start. Nothing about it said chance. It felt like standing inside the shape of someone else's surrender. Loretta did not cry. That was not her way. Tears would have almost brought relief, and relief was not what this moment offered. What came instead was something slower and sharper. She thought of all the years she and Dale had worked without ever quite getting ahead. Jobs taken because they were available, not because they were fair. Repairs delayed until delay turned into risk. Groceries counted, prescriptions compared. Winter heating argued with on paper before either of them admitted what it was doing to the checking account. There had been no single collapse, just a narrowing. A steady trimming away of comfort until one day the line between managing and losing ground had become too thin to trust. Dale walked room to room without saying much, pushing one door, then another, testing the floor with the caution of a man who knew too well what rot could hide. He was not looking for beauty. Loretta knew that. Men like Dale stop looking for beauty in hard times. They look for what will hold, what can be braced, what might last one more winter. But even his face had changed by then. Not into panic, into the harder thing. A look that asked whether effort itself would be enough this time. Loretta crossed back toward the front room and stood still, listening. The house had sounds, but not many. A faint drip somewhere they could not yet place. The dry tick of the walls settling. Wind brushing lightly against the outside. Then something else reached her, not a sound exactly, more a feeling. She looked down. One patch of floor near the old cabinet looked no different from the rest, but when she stepped closer, cold rose through the soles of her shoes so sharply that she stopped where she was. And for the first time since they had turned off that gravel road, Loretta felt something stranger than shame. She felt watched by the house itself. Dale did not answer right away. He looked at Loretta, then at the floor, then back at the cabinet against the wall. It was an old built-in piece, narrow, heavy-looking, the kind nobody would move unless they had a reason. One side had pulled slightly away from the wall over time, leaving a dark seam behind it. The wood along the bottom was darker than the rest, marked by damp air and neglect. Loretta did not speak again. She did not need to. Dale stepped closer and put both hands on the cabinet. He gave it one testing shove. It barely moved. The wood scraped the floor with a low dragging sound that seemed too loud in a house that empty. Dust shook loose from the back edge and lifted into the stale air. He stopped, adjusted his footing, and pushed again, harder this time. The cabinet shifted. Only a few inches, but enough. Loretta saw it first. There, in the floorboards, half hidden beneath years of grit and shadow, was a dark iron ring set flat into the wood. For a second, neither of them moved. It was such a small thing, easy to miss. But it did not belong there by accident. Dale bent slowly and wiped the boards with the side of his hand. More dust came away. The ring was old, blackened with age, fixed solid in place. He touched it once, then looked up at Loretta with a face she had not seen all day. Alert. He slid his fingers through the ring and pulled. Nothing. The wood held. He tried again, harder this time. His shoulders tightened. A dull groan answered from beneath the floor, deep and wooden and old. Not the sound of loose boards. Something heavier. Something fitted. Loretta felt her breath catch. Dale planted one foot, tightened his grip, and pulled with the slow force of a man who knew the difference between something stuck and something sealed. This time, the hatch gave. Not all at once. First a crack, then a rough sucking sound, then a dragging release as the edge lifted from the frame. And then the air changed. Cold rushed up from below. Not outside wind. This was different. Deep cold. Buried cold. The kind that comes from stone and darkness. And something kept hidden a very long time. Loretta stepped back without meaning to. Dale held the hatch open another few inches, and both of them stared down into the gap. At first, all they could see was black. Then Dale reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the flashlight he kept in the truck, and clicked it on. The beam dropped into the opening. Wooden steps, narrow and steep, then stone, then a glint. Water, clear enough to catch the light, moving just enough to prove it was real. The beam slid farther, and the darkness below began to take shape. Fitted stone walls, a low chamber, a space too carefully made to be some accidental crawl space under a laughable little house. Loretta no longer felt the dust or the sag in the roof above them. Beneath their feet was a hidden room no county paper had mentioned, and no mocking voice in that auction room had acted like it existed. The little house was not just sitting on land. It was keeping something. And as Dale lowered the light deeper into the dark, both of them understood the same thing at once. They were going down, and then, slowly, they did. Dale went first, not because he was less afraid, but because that was how he had moved through most of his life. If something looked uncertain, he stepped into it before Loretta had to. He held the flashlight in one hand and the edge of the opening with the other, testing the first step with the careful weight of a man who had learned not to trust old wood until it answered him back. The boards held. He lowered himself another step, then another. Loretta followed. The air changed the farther she went down. Above them, the house had felt stale, close, almost suffocating. But down here, the cold had shape to it. It touched her face, slid under her coat collar, carried a clean mineral smell she had not expected. Stone, Water, earth, oldness without rot. The difference was so sharp it made the little house above feel even sadder somehow, as if all the life had slipped out of it and settled below. When her shoes touched the bottom, she stopped. The chamber was not large, but it was real in a way the house upstairs had not been. The walls were fitted stone, darkened by age but still solid, laid by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. A narrow channel of water moved through one side of the room with a quiet sound that barely rose above a whisper. Clear water, still running, still alive. The floor beneath them was cold and uneven, but not careless. Nothing down there felt accidental. Dale moved the light slowly across the walls. The beam caught a line of low shelves built into the stone, a rusted hook, an old basin, a section of pipe disappearing into shadow. Small things, but each one made the same point. Someone had made this room to be used, not visited once, used, protected, counted on. Loretta turned in place, taking it in. Upstairs, every board and wall had seemed to sag under years of neglect. Down here, the room held itself differently. It had not escaped time. The stone had darkened. The metal had weathered. But none of it felt abandoned in the same way. It felt hidden, preserved, like the part of the property that had once mattered most had been pushed beneath the ruin and left there to wait. That thought settled over her with a force she had not expected. All morning, other people had been deciding what this place meant. A joke, a burden, a bad decision made by two old people with nothing smarter left to do. Even she had started to feel the weight of that version. But standing in that underground room, with cold spring water moving quietly through stone older than either of them, Loretta felt something shift inside her. Not relief. It was too early for relief. And not hope, either. Not the soft kind. It was something firmer than that. The feeling that the story everyone else had told about this house might be wrong. Dale looked back at her then, and for the first time since the auction there was something in his face that had not been there before. Not victory. Not yet. But attention, sharpened by possibility. The kind a man gets when he realizes a thing may be stranger and more valuable than it first appeared. He swept the light once more across the chamber. The beam climbed over stone, crossed the water channel, brushed the shelves, then paused. There, in the far corner, half tucked behind a low partition of rock, was something that did not belong to the room itself. A trunk, dark, heavy-looking, squat against the wall, its metal edges dulled by age, a lock still fixed at the front. Loretta stared at it without moving. If the room had been worth hiding, then whatever sat inside that trunk had been worth hiding even more. Dale did not go to it immediately. He kept the flashlight on the trunk for a few seconds, as if the light itself might tell him whether it was solid, empty, or too damaged to matter. Then he stepped closer. Loretta followed, careful where she placed her feet on the cold floor. The water moved softly beside them, and in that small underground room the sound made everything else feel even quieter. Up close, the trunk looked older than she had thought from across the chamber. Dark wood, iron corners. A lock still fastened at the front, clouded with age but not broken. Dust had settled across the lid in a thin gray film, except for one side where moisture had left faint marks that looked years old. Whatever was inside had been kept below ground on purpose, but it had not been thrown there carelessly. Dale set the flashlight on a shelf so the beam angled toward the corner. He crouched, tested the lock with his fingers, then gave the lid a small lift. Nothing. He looked around once, found a rusted length of flat metal near the wall, and worked it slowly under the clasp. The lock resisted. Then the metal slipped, caught, and with one hard twist gave way with a brittle snap that echoed more sharply than either of them expected. Loretta flinched. For a second they both stood still, listening to the silence settle again. Then Dale lifted the lid. The smell came first. Not rot, not mildew, paper, dry cloth. The faint earthy scent of old storage. The kind that clings to places where hands once sorted, folded, labeled, and stacked things that mattered. Inside the trunk, everything had been arranged in layers. Small paper packets bundled with twine, glass jars sealed with metal lids, thin notebooks stacked flat, folded maps, loose sheets tucked inside larger envelopes. Nothing glittered. Nothing announced itself as treasure. If anything, the contents looked ordinary at first glance. The kind of ordinary that can make people miss the truth entirely if they are only looking for something obvious. Loretta knelt beside the trunk and reached for the nearest packet. The paper was brittle but intact. Across the front, in small, neat handwriting, were 2 words. October beans. She set it down and picked up another. Long yellow corn. Another, winter squash. She looked into the trunk again. More packets, more labels, some in the same careful hand, some in a rougher one. The jars held seeds too. Pale, dark, striped, flat, round. Different sizes, different kinds. One notebook had dates written down the side of the cover. Another had a list of place names she did not recognize right away. Dale leaned in, his face no longer guarded in the same way. He was not smiling, but he was paying attention now with his whole body. Loretta opened the top notebook. The pages were filled edge to edge, rows, short entries, planting dates, rainfall, frost notes, soil remarks, brief lines about blight, shade, drainage, timing. This was not the wandering record of someone who liked gardening well enough to write about it on good days. This was work, careful work, repeated over seasons, meant to be useful later. She turned another page, then another. On one folded map, someone had marked rows and small plots by hand. On a loose note, there were instructions about keeping certain varieties apart. In another bundle, she found packets labeled not by crops, but by surnames. Turner, Blevins, Hale Branch, Messer. She stopped. That was when the contents changed shape in her mind. This was not just a box of saved seeds. These were being tied to families, places, histories. Somebody had not only stored them, somebody had tracked where they came from, who grew them, maybe who gave them over. The care of it all was too exact to be random, too organized to be somebody's forgotten hobby, too protected to be something meant for the back corner of an ordinary shed. Loretta looked back at the spring room around them, the stone walls, the moving water, the cold air that stayed steady, even while the house above rotted. A normal cellar would have been easier. A shelf in a barn would have been easier. A cupboard in the house would have been easier. So why had someone brought all of this down here, into a room hidden beneath the floor, and sealed it in a trunk as though losing it would matter? She reached for another notebook. Halfway through, her fingers stopped on a ragged edge. One page had been torn out. She turned farther and felt something colder than the spring room air. On the inside flap of one packet, a family name had been scratched through so hard it nearly cut the paper. Loretta did not reach for another packet first. She went back to the notebook with the torn page. Dale stayed crouched beside the trunk, the flashlight resting on the stone shelf and throwing a steady beam across the open lid. Neither of them seemed ready to climb back upstairs. The house above, with its sagging roof and stale rooms, already felt less important than this cold chamber beneath it. Whatever truth the property held, it was down here. Loretta turned the journal carefully, supporting the spine with one hand. The paper was old but not neglected. Someone had handled these books with the kind of respect usually given to things meant to outlast the person holding them. The writing inside was neat, practical, almost spare. No flourishes, no wasted words, dates, locations, rainfall, frost windows, soil texture, shade hours, which rows failed after late damp, which beans held longer in poor ground, which corn matured fast enough to outrun an early cold snap. It was the language of somebody who had learned by doing and had no patience for pretending. She turned another page, then another. The pattern became clearer. This was not one garden, not one season, not even one family. The entries moved across years, then across places. A note beside one seed lot said saved from Turner Place before sale. Another mentioned cuttings traded after Messer Orchard was cleared. A list tucked between pages recorded who had good pole beans in dry years, who kept a squash line going after a bad blight, who still planted old white corn when everyone else switched to store seed. Little by little, the shape of it emerged. Someone had been collecting more than seed. They had been collecting what people knew. Loretta felt that understanding land slowly. It made the room different, made the trunk different, made the whole little house different. This was not the storage habit of somebody who hated waste. It was a preservation effort. Quiet, patient, intentional. A person, maybe more than one over time, had been gathering heirloom varieties, and the practical knowledge tied to them from farms that were disappearing across that stretch of Kentucky. Farms sold off, absorbed, cleared out, let go. Families aging out, children moving away, lines of memory shrinking with the land itself. Dale must have felt the same shift, because when he finally spoke, his voice came low. Somebody was saving it. Loretta did not answer right away. Because the truth was, that did not fully explain the room. Saving things was one matter. Hiding them was another. She turned back to the torn page. The missing sheet had not come loose on its own. The edge was too rough in one place, too clean in another. Somebody had pulled it out by hand, deliberately. Not long before the notebook had been closed for the last time either, judging by how little the surrounding pages had settled. She turned farther and found the packet again, with the scratched-out surname. The pressure of the mark had almost cut through the paper, not crossed out casually, struck through. That was not weather. That was not age. That was anger or fear. Loretta looked at the labels again. Turner, Messer, Hale Branch, Blevins. Her eyes stopped there. Blevins. She did not say the name out loud at first. She only held the packet a moment longer than the others. Above them, Kurt Blevins had called the place headache ground with too much confidence. He had spoken like a man brushing away trouble he already knew. And then, when the bid was low enough to steal, he had let them take it. Not stop them, not challenge them. Let them. A thought moved through Loretta then, quiet and unwelcome. What if Kurt had not been relieved the place sold because it was worthless? What if he had been relieved because it sold to people he assumed would never understand what they had? She went back to the journal and found one more small line in the margin of an entry about seed separation and spring moisture. It was easy to miss. The writing was thinner there, almost pressed into the paper instead of written across it. Keep below, not for open shelving. No explanation. No reason. Just that. Loretta sat back on her heels and let the cold room settle around her. The spring moved softly through stone. Dale waited beside her. Neither of them rushed to speak, because now the discovery had changed again. It was no longer just strange, no longer just valuable. It had acquired an edge. This room had not only been built to keep things cool, it may have been built to keep them out of sight. And if that was true, then somebody, at some point, had wanted this knowledge protected from more than weather, mice, and time. Loretta closed the notebook slowly and looked at the trunk one more time. There was only one honest way to find out whether the person who hid all this had preserved memory or preserved a future. They would have to plant it. They did not carry the whole trunk upstairs at once. Some things were too old for that, too fragile, too uncertain. So the next 2 days became a kind of careful sorting, one trip at a time. One notebook, one packet, one jar, one bundle of tied notes brought up from the spring room and laid out where light could reach them. Loretta used the small table near the window because it was the only surface in the house that felt level enough to trust. She spread an old dish towel across it first. Then she began arranging the seed packets by year, by condition, by how much handwriting on the front matched what the journals seemed to trust. Dale worked outside. That was how the division happened without either of them needing to name it. Loretta read, sorted, compared. Dale cleared, lifted, braced, dragged. He pulled dead vine from the porch rail, cut back brush near the side of the house, marked off a strip of ground where the journals suggested the old keeper had once planted close enough to the spring-fed soil to hold moisture without drowning the roots. None of it looked graceful. Their age would not allow graceful. He had to stop more often than he wanted. Straighten slowly. Put a hand against his lower back. Stand still until the tightness eased enough to keep going. Inside, Loretta's work carried its own strain. The packets were not all in the same shape. Some were crisp and dry, their paper still firm. Others had softened at the edges or faded almost blank. A few jars held seeds so small they looked like grit until the afternoon light caught them. She made little piles. Strongest chance, maybe, too damaged to trust. Every decision felt heavier than it should have, because this was no longer just sorting. It was choosing which buried hopes deserved one more chance in the ground. The journals helped, but only up to a point. The notes were practical, not generous. Somebody had written them for use, not explanation. Good after late cold. Separate from yellow row. Save only from strongest stalks. Watch for rot if spring stays wet. Loretta found herself leaning closer, reading the same lines twice, then a third time, matching entries to labels, labels to dates, dates to the names written on the packets. Turner beans, Messer squash, white half-runner, dry hill corn. She had not expected a trunk of seed to feel so much like listening to voices. By the third morning, they were ready to try. Only a few rows, that was all. They could not risk everything at once, not with seeds this old, and no certainty about what any of it still held. Dale broke the earth with slow, measured strokes. Loretta walked behind him, dropping seed by hand the way she had done with gardens years ago when gardens still felt ordinary. Now every small motion carried tension. Cover, press, move on. Another row, another packet, another little wager made against time. Then came the waiting. Some failed fast. One row showed nothing at all. Another softened in the ground and vanished. A third came up weak and pale, then bent over on itself before it had any real chance. Dale said little during those days, but the silence around him changed. Loretta could hear it each evening when he stepped back from the patch and looked over work that had asked more from his body than the ground had yet agreed to return. And then, not all at once, something answered back, a line of green. So fine at first Loretta thought it might be grass. Then another. Then 3 shoots in the row she had nearly dismissed as too old to bother with. She knelt to look closer, not trusting hope too quickly. But there they were. Small, upright, alive. Not enough to call it success. Not yet. But enough to prove the trunk had not been carrying only memory. Something in that hidden room had endured. And before long, other eyes would begin to notice it too. It began quietly. Not with a confrontation, not with some dramatic knock at the door, just little changes. The kind most people could dismiss if they had not spent a lifetime learning how quickly other people's interest can shift when value enters a room. The first time Loretta noticed it, a pickup slowed on the road and stayed there a beat too long. Not stopped, not enough to invite a wave, just rolling slow past the house while the driver looked across the patch Dale had cleared and the short new rows beginning to show green. Then it moved on. The next day, another car did the same. Dale barely looked up from the porch rail he was trying to brace. He said people slowed for all kinds of reasons out on back roads, looking for an address, taking a call, wondering if they had missed a turn. Loretta did not argue, but she knew the difference between passing by and checking on something. By the end of the week, the feeling had settled more firmly over the place. A woman from farther down the road drove by twice in one afternoon. A man walking a fence line on the neighboring property paused with his hands on the top wire and looked longer than courtesy required. Even the stillness around the house felt altered, as if the land had stopped being invisible. Then Dale's niece called. That, more than the passing cars, told Loretta the story was moving beyond the road. The niece had not been cruel before, just absent in the ordinary way people get absent when older relatives no longer seem central to anything. But now her voice came soft with concern, asking how they were settling in, whether the house was safe, whether they needed help with anything. Loretta listened and heard what was underneath it. Not love, exactly. Not even guilt. Curiosity dressed in family language. She answered politely, gave away nothing. When the call ended, Dale said maybe the girl had just heard they'd bought a place and wanted to make sure they were all right. Loretta only looked toward the window. People did not suddenly become attentive for no reason. 2 mornings later, Kurt Blevins came by. He did not arrive with the same easy smirk he had worn at the county sale. That was the first thing Loretta noticed. The second was that he had come empty-handed and unhurried, which meant he had not stopped by on the way to anywhere else. He had come because he meant to. His truck rolled into the edge of the yard and stayed there while he stepped out, looked around once, then rested his forearms on the fence rail as though he were a neighbor taking in the weather. His tone, when he called out to Dale, was warm enough to sound friendly if you had not heard the auction room. Dale answered him from near the porch. Loretta stayed where she was, half inside the door, hands still. Kurt asked how the place was treating them. Said it looked like they were getting more done than he expected. Mentioned the ground over there had always held moisture differently. Said it in passing. Casual. Too casual. Loretta felt something go still inside her. Because there it was. Not laughter. Not pity. Knowledge. Kurt Blevins knew something about that land. And he had started talking like a man, measuring the right moment to use it. Kurt did not make his move that day. He waited, just long enough to make it seem natural, just long enough to let the new tone settle in around the property. That was what made Loretta uneasy. Men who rush show their hunger too fast. Men who wait usually believe time is on their side. 3 days passed before he came back. By then, the little patch behind the house had changed enough to be noticed from the road. Not lush, not impressive, but alive. A few rows had held, others had strengthened. The first green had deepened in color. It gave the place a look it had not carried when they arrived. Not beauty exactly, but intention. Something was happening there. Something Dale had begun to depend on more than he admitted. That morning he was crouched at the edge of one row, studying a patch that had gone weak overnight. Several seedlings had thinned and bent. The leaves looked wrong, too pale at the tips, too soft through the middle. He touched the soil, then looked toward the spring side of the property as if the land itself had failed to answer him. Loretta saw the change in his face before he spoke. It was not panic. It was hurt. Because this was no longer just a test plot, not to him. Those small green rows had become a way to believe the trunk meant something real, that the room under the house had not opened onto memory alone. And now part of it was faltering in front of him. That was when Kurt's truck rolled in. He stepped out slowly, not smiling too much, hands loose at his sides, wearing that careful expression people use when they want credit for concern before they have earned any. He looked at the house first, then the rows, then Dale. "Looks like you've got some work into it," he said. Dale straightened, one hand pressing briefly into his lower back. Loretta stayed near the porch steps with a seed jar in one hand, not moving closer. Kurt walked only partway across the yard. Not pushy, not yet. He kept enough distance to make himself seem respectful, then let his eyes travel once more across the cleared ground and the side of the house. "Hate to say it," he went on, "but places like this can turn complicated on folks." The word sat there between them. Complicated. He said it like a man discussing weather, like he was saving them trouble out of simple decency. Then he mentioned upkeep, access, water, county questions that sometimes come up when old structures had sat too long. He did not explain much. He did not need to. The point was not information. The point was pressure. To make uncertainty feel larger than ownership. Then he gave them the heart of it. Said if they ever decided they did not want the headache, he might be willing to take the parcel off their hands before it became more trouble than it was worth. Said older folks sometimes did better knowing when to let a thing go. Loretta watched Dale absorb every word. That was the danger. Not that Kurt had legal power over them, not that he could snatch the place outright. The danger was smaller and meaner than that. Fatigue, doubt, a body that hurt. Rose that had started to weaken, the long habit of believing other people when they spoke with enough certainty. Kurt named a number. It was low. Low enough to insult them, but high enough to tempt anyone who had spent years one surprise bill away from trouble. Dale did not answer right away. His silence stretched. Loretta could almost feel the strain working through him, pride wrestling with exhaustion, caution wrestling with hope. Kurt mistook that silence for movement. He softened his tone further, said there was no shame in cutting loose from a bad gamble, said he was only trying to look out for them. That was when Loretta understood the full shape of the threat. Kurt did not need them to be ignorant. He only needed them to be tired. After he left, Dale stood looking at the thinning row long after the dust from Kurt's truck had settled. He did not say he was considering it. He did not say anything at all, which was worse, because Loretta knew what silence like that meant. It meant the house, the spring room, the seeds, the strange hidden story beneath their feet. All of it was now balanced against one dangerous question. What if Kurt was right, and they were too worn down to hold on long enough to understand what they had? That evening, Loretta went back to the journals. Not for comfort, for proof. Loretta did not open the journals like a woman looking for reassurance. She opened them like a woman done being handled. The house was quiet by then. Dale had gone outside again, not to work exactly, just to stand near the rows and look at them, as if looking long enough might change what was happening in the soil. The weak patch had not improved by evening. A few leaves had curled farther in on themselves. The sight of it had landed harder on him than he wanted to show, and Loretta knew why. Because once a person starts hoping again, even carefully, any small failure begins to feel larger than it is. She carried the notebook back to the table near the window and sat down under the thin light. No rushing now, no guessing. If the room under the house had protected anything worth preserving, then the truth of it had to be in the pages, not in Kurt Blevins' voice, and not in Dale's weariness. Loretta turned to the entries tied to spring plots and low ground, then to the notes. That mentioned seep lines, cold pockets, and rows planted nearest steady moisture. She read with her finger under the words, moving slowly, matching labels to dates, dates to maps, maps to the little patch behind the house. The writing was brief but exact. Some varieties failed in open heat, some rotted if crowded. Some needed distance from others to stay true, but a few, marked more than once, in more than 1 year, did better in ground touched by spring water. That was the phrase. Spring-touched ground. Not flooded, not wet, not low and sour. Spring-touched. Loretta looked up from the page and held still for a moment. That was not guesswork. That was observation repeated enough times to become trusted knowledge. The keeper of the archive had not hidden these seeds because they were old. They had hidden them because they were specific, place-bound, made strong by conditions most people would overlook, and ruined by treating every piece of land the same. She went back through another notebook and found it again in different words. Cool pull under root line. Holds in dry weeks. Better near Stone Run. Then another line beside one of the surviving varieties they had planted. Keep for springside only. Loretta leaned back slowly. Kurt had seen a tired house, a small parcel, 2 aging people, maybe even a little water and moisture in the ground. What he had not seen, what he had never bothered to understand, was that the land and the archive belonged together. The room below, the spring itself, the notes, the seeds. The place had not been hidden because it was useless. It had been hidden because somebody knew its value could be erased by people too impatient, too arrogant, or too careless to recognize what made it rare. And then, with that realization, something else settled into place. It was not only about Kurt. It was about years. Years of watching decisions arrive in voices more certain than hers. Years of being told what made sense, what could wait, what was worth fixing, what was worth letting go. Years of adjusting, enduring, making do. She had done it so long it had almost started to sound like wisdom. But there was another side to it too, a quieter loss. The habit of letting other people name the value of things before she had fully named it for herself. Not this time. When Kurt's truck returned the next afternoon, Loretta was already outside. Dale came around from the side of the house as Kurt stepped down into the yard, wearing the same measured expression, the same careful concern. He started with the weather, then the ground, then the weak patch in the rows, as if he had every right to notice it. He said he hoped they had thought over what he mentioned, said he could still help them out before they got in deeper. Loretta did not let him finish building the little speech. She stepped off the porch and stood where he had to look directly at her. Her voice, when it came, was even. "We're not selling you our mistake," she said, "because it isn't one." That was all. No anger, no drama, just a line spoken with the kind of calm that leaves no room to bargain. Kurt's face changed only slightly, but slightly was enough. His mouth tightened. His eyes moved once toward the house, then toward the rows, then back to Loretta, as though he had finally understood the problem. She was not confused. She was not tired in the way he needed her to be. And whatever he thought he knew about that parcel, she now believed there was more. Kurt left without pushing harder. But after he was gone, the yard did not feel safe, only defended. Because Loretta had won the moment. Now the land would have to win the rest. And that would depend on whether the surviving rows could become something no one, not even Kurt Blevins, could dismiss. What changed first was not the size of the harvest. It was the look of it. By late summer, the strongest rows had taken on a character even Loretta could see before she had words for it. The beans held differently on the vine. The squash came in with thicker necks and deeper color. One corn row stood tighter through a dry stretch that had weakened newer seed in a neighbor's field down the road. None of it looked dramatic from a distance. This was not abundance spilling over baskets for the sake of a pretty story. It was something quieter and in its own way more convincing. The surviving varieties had not merely grown. They had belonged. Loretta felt that every time she carried a bowl inside and set it on the counter under the morning light, the shapes were not identical. The color was not factory even. Some ears were smaller than what stores trained people to trust, but the journals had warned her about that. Yield was never the only measure. Holding through heat mattered. Holding through dry weeks mattered. Flavor mattered. Seed worth saving mattered. So she began writing. At first, only in pencil on loose scraps. Then, one evening, she opened one of the old notebooks and added a small line beneath an entry from decades earlier. Good return after thin rain. Held shape better than expected, she stared at her own handwriting beside the older hand for a long moment. It affected her more than she expected, because that was when the archive stopped feeling inherited and started feeling continued. Dale changed too. He did not say it out loud. That was not his way. But the shame he had carried from the auction was gone now. In its place was something steadier. He fixed the porch step that had rocked under his boot the first day, rehung the back door so it shut clean, built a better cover for the hatch leading down to the spring room. He treated that room like the heart of the property, not because it was mysterious anymore, but because he understood what it had made possible. And once people sensed there was something real there, the tone around the house changed again. Not loudly. That was what made it matter. A woman from a nearby church stopped by with a basket and left with questions. A man who had once raised produce before his knees gave out looked over one of the bean rows and named it before Loretta could. Said he had not seen that line in years. Another older grower studied the corn and asked where in the world they had found seed that held like that in spring-touched ground. Loretta did not tell everything, but she told enough. Enough for the story of the house to begin moving through the area in a different way. No longer as laughter. No longer as curiosity sharpened by greed. It traveled now in low voices. The respectful kind. The old place with the spring room. The couple bringing back lost seed. The little house people had mocked. Even Kurt stopped coming by. Whether that was pride or patience, Loretta could not yet tell. But by then, the question had changed anyway. The land had answered enough to prove she had been right to refuse him. The harvest had given them something practical, something visible, something nobody honest could dismiss. What remained now was harder and deeper. Because proving the house had value was one thing. Closing the wound that opened the day people laughed at them was another. By the time autumn settled fully into the hills, the little house no longer looked like a punchline. It was still small, still weathered, still easy to miss if a person only glanced at it from the road. The roof had not turned new. The boards had not straightened themselves into some magazine version of redemption, but that was never the story. The story was not that the place became beautiful enough for other people's approval. It was that it became true. The porch held steady now under Dale's weight. The back door shut clean. Brush had been cut back far enough to let the morning light find the windows. And beneath the house, under the patched floor and the careful hatch he had rebuilt, the spring room remained cold and steady through every change above it. Water still moved through the stone channel with that same low sound that had first stopped Loretta in her tracks. Only now it no longer felt like a secret waiting in the dark. It felt like part of the household. That was the deepest change. The room under the house had gone from mystery to work to rhythm. Seed jars sat where they belonged. Packets were sorted with fresh care. The old journals had not been replaced. They had been joined. Loretta's writing now appeared beside the earlier entries in the same pages that had once felt almost too important to touch. New notes, new dates, new weather patterns. Her own small observations added without ceremony, but with confidence. She no longer wrote like a visitor borrowing somebody else's knowledge. She wrote like a keeper. Dale carried his share in quieter ways. He knew which boards above the spring room had to stay dry, which hinge needed oil before winter, which section of roof could wait and which could not. He moved through the place with the calm attention of a man no longer apologizing for what he owned. The shame from the county sale had burned off him so gradually he might not have noticed it himself, but Loretta had. It was there in the way he stood now when trucks passed on the road, in the way he answered questions without lowering his voice, in the way his hand rested on the porch rail, not like he was bracing himself, but like he belonged there. People still talked, of course. Small places always do. But the sound of it had changed. The house was no longer mentioned with amusement. It was talked about with that low, careful respect reserved for things people had once judged too quickly and now preferred to approach with better manners. A few of those same faces from the sale had passed by since then. Some slowed. Some looked. None laughed. By then, it would not have mattered if they had. That was the part no one in that auction room could have imagined. The real return on that $7 house was never revenge. It was freedom from needing it. Loretta and Dale no longer required the people who mocked them to witness their correction. The land had answered. The work had answered. The rose they had brought back to life had answered. What more did they need? One evening, with the air turning colder again, Loretta stood at the table by the window and wrote the season's final note beside an older entry about spring-touched ground. She paused after the last line and looked down at the two hands sharing that page across time. Then she closed the journal and listened. Water below, wind outside, Dale moving on the porch. A year earlier, people had watched them buy that house and seen proof that life had cornered them. What was hidden beneath it had been waiting to say something else, that they were not finished, that usefulness had not left them, that judgment, patience, and quiet endurance still counted for something, and that sometimes the thing the world laughs at first is the very thing carrying your future home. If this story stayed with you, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because stories like this remind us that what looks small, broken, or forgotten can still change everything. And now tell me this in the comments. If you were standing in Loretta's shoes that day at the auction, would you have walked away from that $7 house, or taken the risk anyway.